Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on our third in the series, Context Matters, Caribbean Children in State Care. And the panel today will be on contemporary debates. I'm going to introduce our moderator today. Our moderator is Dr. Yewande Louise-Folcom. She's a lecturer in the School of Education at UWI-Mona and teaches and researches in the areas of English language and literacy within Creole-speaking environments. She's heavily involved in teacher training at various levels of the education system. She received her doctorate from the University of Iowa and her master's degree from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Her work has been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Changing English, Journal of Education and Development in the Caribbean, and the UWI Quality Education Journal. Over her 10 years of teaching at the tertiary level, she has supervised many graduate students who have been intrigued by the relationship between home and school and its impact on student achievement. Outside of her professional life, she reads and spends time with her family. She's married to Daniel Folcom and they have one son, Timothy. Okay, Dr. Folcom, on to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roper. So with us, we have four very competent panelists. We have, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll present. We have Mrs. Jacqueline Seeley-Burke. She is a legal consultant with over 20 years of practical experience as a lawyer and consultant. She has produced a wealth of research reports for international and regional agencies, including UNICEF, UN Women, the World Bank, OECS Commission, the OECS Supreme Court, the Commonwealth Secretariat, and the CARICOM Secretariat. She's an educator, and she, having lectured with the Women's Studies program at the University of Toronto, Canada, for over 15 years. Her area of academic focus is family violence. The two areas of child justice and gender-based violence feature very centrally in Mrs. Seeley-Burke's social justice work. In addition to extensive research, she has developed legal and policy frameworks for the advancement of children and families. This includes the production of child abuse and domestic violence laws and protocols for Grenada, St. Kitts and Nevis, Barbados, the British Virgin Islands, and other Caribbean countries. Her child justice experience is far-reaching, having offered her expertise across the greater part of the region. Our next panelist is Dr. Leanne Levers. She's a political scientist focusing on strategic advocacy and communications in the areas of justice reform, global health, gender equality, and racial equity. She has a history of developing and implementing successful campaigns around gender-based violence, maternal health, and human rights. She's also the co-founder of Dope Black Woman, a global nonprofit dedicated to the empowerment of Black women. We have as our third panelist, Mrs. Cecile Minot. She's the director for the Consortium for Social Development and Research at the University of the West Indies Open Campus. She holds a Master in Education with specialization in counseling from the University of South Florida, Tampa. Her interest centers on early childhood education and counseling, and she has published in these areas in peer-reviewed journals. She developed and implemented the first laboratory preschool in Jamaica at the UWI, and she leads the team that developed the continuing education program in early childhood education, as well as the first online MPhil PhD research program in child, adolescent, and youth studies for the University of the West Indies Open Campus. She has collaborated with the researchers, practitioners, and policymakers in developing policies, curricula, and the training of early childhood teachers and teacher trainers in the region. And we have with us Mr. Warren Thompson. He is a social worker at the heart with a passion to see the well-being and quality of life of others improved. He is the current director of the Child and Family Programs at the Child Protection and Family Services Agency, CPFSA, a post he has held since January 2022. Prior to this, he served as the Deputy Registrar at the Office of the Children's Registry, OCR, and later CPFSA's National Children's Registry, following the merger of the OCR and the Child Development Agency in 2017. Mr. Thompson holds a BSc in social work with postgraduate training in gender and development studies. He's an adjunct lecturer in the MSc program at the UWI Institute for Gender and Development Studies and an adjunct research supervisor in the MSW program at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. He has researched and published in the fields of gender studies, social work, and community development. So that is a mouthful, right? So these persons are very well qualified, and each presenter will have 15 minutes to present. Our first presenter, first panelist will be Mrs. Jacqueline Seeley-Burke.
You're muted.
You are muted.
Pleasant good afternoon to everyone. I'm going to share my screen with you. Let's get that up. Okay. Is that up and available to everyone?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
Okay, pleasant good afternoon, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Children who suffer harm, whether physical, sexual, or emotional, are children who would be legally defined as in need of care and protection, and therefore falling within the state's care mandate. So with that in mind, I want to draw on some of the findings of a fairly significant research undertaken, large research undertaking commissioned by UNICEF and the OECS Commission a few years ago. It was a project designed to provide baseline assessments of the child protection systems in all 6 of the OECS member states. So that would be Antigua, Dominica, Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Kitts, Nevis, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines. But it also included the 3 overseas territories of Anguilla, BVI, and Montserrat. So we undertook country-specific research in 9 states over 18 months. It was not a small task, but very rewarding in terms of the richness of the research findings. So in the OECS, like much of the region, child protection has come under significant scrutiny as we strive to improve compliance with the international standards that we have committed to, including the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So it's against this backdrop that the OECS, in partnership with UNICEF, commissioned the baseline assessments with the intention of conducting a gap analysis for each member state, whilst also highlighting good practices and lessons learned. Now, that last objective of identifying lessons learned was important because our Caribbean countries often make the same mistakes. We fall into the same traps, and yet we don't seem to learn from each other. Given the size of our member states in the OECS region and our physical proximity, it was important that we benefited from each other's strengths, but that we also avoided each other's pitfalls. So we assessed the system looking at the 3 thematic areas of law and policy, institutional arrangements, services and programs. And so what I want to do is touch on each of these areas very briefly, starting with law and policy. Now, child protection law was deficient in the OECS region in several respects, but the main challenges were as listed there. Most countries had lack of a separate legislative framework. So our juvenile acts dealt with both children in need of care and protection because of abuse, as well as children in conflict with the law. And what happened as we examined those legislative frameworks across most of the island states was that the child protection objectives were clearly an afterthought. And even the language within the legislation was very criminal in its context because of the children in conflict with the law component of the legislation. So there was need for separate legislative frameworks. There were limited or outdated definitions of child abuse. Most of the legislative frameworks did not capture mandatory reporting. So whereas there were policies in many countries that spoke to, certain duty bearers having to report child abuse, this was often not codified. It was not captured in law. There was insufficient delineation of the powers of the legally mandated child protection agencies, and the child protection agencies were not always clear on their own powers because the law had not sufficiently defined those powers. There was limited availability of types of orders or interventions to assist children and their families, so very uncreative. You were either brought into care or not brought into care. So the range of orders that we have in between there, assessment orders, supervision orders, all the different types of far more innovative orders that we're seeing with modern pieces of legislation were sadly lacking. And then there was lack of guidance on the different stages of addressing child abuse, from reporting through investigation and placement of children. And that was because we did not have the specialized legal framework. So fully aware of the dire need for law reform, the attorneys general of the region collectively agreed, and it was back in 2005 or thereabouts, to endorse the OECS Family Law Reform Project that modernized family law across the region, but would also facilitate much needed consistency in the laws across the member states. And one of the model bills that was developed in the first batch of legislation was the Child Protection Act. And the model legislation, it was excellent. And it very deliberately addressed all of the aforementioned gaps that I just identified in the law. In fact, it was sufficiently impressive that has paved the way for reform in other Caribbean countries outside of the OECS subregion, with, for example, both Turks and Caicos and Barbados now relying very heavily on that legislative framework to inform its own law reform. Regrettably, however, the law reform process across the OECS region has been painfully slow, and model bills that were drafted as far back as 2005 have taken more than a decade for most of the member states to enact in Parliament, with a couple of the bills still outstanding and in some member states, and one member state yet to pass any of them. Even more concerning, however, is that even where the new laws have been passed, we're seeing evidence of compromised enforcement as countries are still trying to put the mechanisms in place to ensure better compliance. Some of the challenges have been weak institutional arrangements, which we'll look at to support the legislation, lack of sustained training and capacity building to ensure adequate levels of familiarity with the new laws, and in some instances, just an unwillingness to let go of the status quo despite its deficiencies. So when I went into one of the countries to do the assessment, they had the new law, but they were using the old law because no one felt comfortable with the new legislative framework and felt, well, let's just keep using what we've always had. And so as positive as the law reform process has been, its slow pace has been inevitably undermined has inevitably undermined the protection of vulnerable children who need strong legal responses to the violence, exploitation, and other forms of harm that they are experiencing. Similarly, quickly, policy reform is happening, albeit in varying degrees across member states, but this too has been undermined by poor implementation. So we can point to fancy action plans, protocols, SOPs, standard operating procedures, but too often they are simply not being satisfactorily implemented. And because I've worked across the Caribbean, outside of the OECS, I can tell you that this is an issue not just for the OECS, but for the region. Way too much development of law and policy that is not being adequately enforced. Let's go quickly to institutional arrangements. All the member states have some form of institutional arrangement to respond to children who are in need of care. With some doing better than others, because there are those who have created specialized agencies that deal exclusively with child protection. So Grenada has that. Outside of that, you know that other Caribbean countries, Trinidad, Barbados, Jamaica, they have that. But within the OECS, there are too many of our member states bringing child protection under the jurisdiction of their broader ministries of social development or its equivalent, where social workers are handling a range of other duties from custody and child support, court reports, to psychosocial type interventions, to social safety net programs. So child protection gets lost in the mix. It's not a dedicated, specialized service in many of the OECS states, even though the assessments that we did confirmed that countries recognize and aspire to that ideal. And so the assessments portrayed a system that is generally challenged by a lack of specialization, limited human and infrastructural resources, including alternative care placements, and weak coordination between service providers. Human resource capacity is critical because we cannot have children being removed from their families and communities, brought into the care and control of the state, only to be further neglected, abused, or exploited. You know, we cannot have children who have experienced violence and other forms of harm in their homes and in their communities, experiencing the same thing whilst in the care of the state. Yet it happens. I'm also particularly frustrated by the weak coordination between essential service providers, whether it's health, social services, education, law enforcement, or justice, where the left hand sometimes has no idea what the right hand is doing. And this is still happening despite the creation of protocols, as I said, SOPs, standing orders. And why? It takes us right back to the point of compromise implementation. I want to move to services and programs.
You have 3 minutes left.
There are a number of service or programmatic gaps that were identified. Can't address them all, they're listed there. We'll only highlight a few. Let me talk about the lack of established plans of care. We need to be very clear on how we intend to address the needs of children who are brought into state care. What do they need? How will we deliver on those needs? What timeframes? Where will they be placed? All of those types of issues. But in the OECS, what we found was that there was a deficiency in sort of having written care plans. The law has now addressed that. It's no longer just an expected good practice. It is a legal requirement. So written care plans have to be developed and shared with the court before the judicial officer will finalize an order. Tied to this issue is the accessibility of support and rehabilitative services, not only for the children that we remove and place in state care, but for the families that we separated them from. I think we talk so nonchalantly about the overriding objective of family reunification in child protection cases, but do we really invest attention, and resources that is required to support these families, whether it's meaningful substance abuse programming, readily available and consistently offered parenting programs, appropriate counseling and other psychosocial support, and very importantly, assistance with basic needs like housing, food, material supplies. You know, we say that poverty on its own should not be a determinative factor in child protection cases, but we know that in reality, families that are unable to provide the basic necessities for children can and do have their children removed until they can establish the ability to create safe environments for them. So what are we doing for them? We cannot continue to focus on the rehabilitation solely of the children that we bring into care without addressing the other and oftentimes more complicated side of the equation, their families. I just need 3 more minutes. Weak foster care systems. The OECS hasn't been doing badly in terms of using foster care as an alternative to institutional care, which we know is the preferred option. We did a foster care assessment a few years ago. At that time, available data from across the OECS revealed that there were about 810 children in alternative care. 484 of them were in foster care, that's 59%. 127 in kinship care, that's about 16%. And 199 in institutional care, that was about 25%. This means that family-based care, when you combine kinship care and foster care, amounts to 75% of our region's children. That's a very positive trend. However, the assessment also revealed that despite the reliance on foster care as a placement for children, that system was experiencing its share of challenges. And these included compromised recruitment, weak incentives for people to offer their households for foster care, you know, and we can have a huge philosophical debate about what kinds of allowances should be offered for foster care, because some argue that we don't want to commercialize it, as has happened in the North American context, but we also certainly cannot expect foster carers to absorb the huge financial burden of offering these children a home. So lots of challenges with foster care. I wanted to deal with the issue of legal representation, but I may not have time. Suffice it to say that children in state care have the right to have their independent views and preferences put squarely on the table for consideration. And this is not happening. It's not happening in the OECS, and it's not happening for a large part across the region either. Even those countries that say that they have legal aid for children or that they have child advocates for children. In child protection matters, it's not the independent views and preferences of the child that's being put forward. We're still putting forward, you know, almost this, what we call amicus curiae or guardian ad litem kind of approach, where we're speaking about what's in the best interest of the child, without the child's views and preferences being put clearly into the mix. So many. Yes, I just wanted to end by saying that children in state care are heavily dependent on the efficiency and effectiveness of the system for their safety and protection. And I think that the assessments powerfully demonstrated that there's still a steep gradient to be climbed in our efforts to achieve that system. And, you know, I'm happy that we have sessions like this where we can share information and be aware of what's happening across the different countries. So thank you for creating the forum, and thank you for all of you for listening and participating. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Seeley-Burke, for setting us off to a very good start in terms of just the thoroughness and the richness of that OECS study. Thank you very much. Dr. Roper, do we open for questions now or at the end of
at the end.
All of them? Okay.
All right, so we have
Right.
Dr. Levers.
Our next presenter, right, is Dr. Leanne Levers. And as before, you have 15 minutes, and I will put in the chat when you have 5 minutes left, 1 minute left, and then time is up, and then you'll hear my voice.
Sure. Thank you.
All right, then. Sure.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here and having me. I'm just going to share my screen. Can everyone see that?
Yes, we're seeing your screen.
So I'm presenting around governance and accountability, which was done, which is based on research that was done last year, around March of last year, just to give it some time-sensitive context. So at the time, there are approximately 5,000 children in state care that were under the care of the Child Protection and Family Services Act, or agency, sorry. And 60% of those children are typically sent to state care because they are considered uncontrollable, which can mean anything from having a disability to simply being unwanted to being perceived as sexually promiscuous. So this report really looked at the governance and accountability of the report looks at the role that governance and accountability plays when in the quality of care for this particularly vulnerable group of children based on an ideal approach that's set out by human rights standards. So the research generally across jurisdictions shows that state care should be a temporary short-term replacement for the family unit. So family-based care is always the best option. And according to research, long periods of time in state care, regardless of the quality, generally produce poorer outcomes for children, which you can see on the slide. And while there's no available data in Jamaica, the general consensus is that the longer amount of time that you spend in state care is the more likely you are to have particular issues, or ranging from psychological care to the ability to transition into kind of normal adult life. So 20 previous reports have highlighted that consistently, Jamaica children in need and care of protection experience instances of abuse, substandard living conditions. So over the last 10 years, JFJ noted more than 1,600 critical incidents taking place in childcare. In terms of physical abuse, we saw 500 reported cases of abuse between 2006 to 2010, many of which were perpetrated by staff. We also saw that there was an issue with sexual abuse, where the average age of intercourse for young children in state care was 11 years old. And then of a sample of 60 girls who were tested in state care, approximately a third of those tested positive for STDs. We also see some issues in terms of psychosocial problems, such as suicidal tendencies, social withdrawal, and so on. In terms of educational reports, there were also reports that children were being denied access to education in response to punishment for poor behavior. So we really tried to look at the governance as a comprehensive system to try and identify the systemic gaps within the childcare system. And governance is really essentially the way something is run. And as you can see, based on these kind of standards or characteristics of good governance are based on international human rights standards, such as the UN Guidelines on Alternative Care and the CRC. So in using this human rights framework, we found four main issues or four main areas of concern across the state care system: the administrative capacity, monitoring and evaluation, use of evidence-based policy, and collaboration and strategic involvement of all stakeholders, but particularly children. So in terms of administrative weakness, we found that the governance structure was really disjointed. So many of the agencies that are involved in the child care protection system sit across multiple ministries. So for instance, CISOCA sits within the Ministry of National Security. Meanwhile, CPFSA sits within the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information. And despite sitting under the MOE, it's directly financed by the Ministry of Finance, which means that the governing ministry has very little control over the budget. We also see in terms of legislative issues that there was some gaps sitting there as well. So the CPFSA within the CCPA, the Child Care and Protection Act, is not actually named as the agency responsible for child care and protection in Jamaica. Then also there's no real legislative authority for the adoption board, and so there's often duplication of efforts in terms of roles and responsibilities across the adoption board and the CPFSA. And there's also some lack of database management. So this might have changed, but up until last year, the NCR was, or a few years ago, the NCR was still using Microsoft Word to log its cases, while the CDA was using Sohimo, a software database system. We also saw a lack of resources. So 4 psychologists were servicing more than 4,000 children in state care. We also saw an overload in terms of social workers. So 100 social workers had a caseload of 150, which is overwhelming in comparison to the international standard of 10 to 30 cases per social worker. But in addition to the fact that foster care parents often receive very limited sums of, or very limited stipends to support the taking care of the foster children. In terms of monitoring and evaluation, or monitoring and oversight, we also saw that there was no real oversight or independent oversight body that holds the relevant agencies accountable, including the CPFSA. While the CRC does offer a number of options in terms of monitoring, our last report to this CRC, to the committee, was submitted in 2005, even though the due date was 2008. And so the optional protocol for the CRC also has not been ratified. I know recently that the advisory council has been put in place, so that has subsequently changed. But generally, we found a kind of consistent history of inconsistent and limited monitoring by the CPFSA in terms of its approach to monitoring foster care, educational programs, interaction with foster care parents was also quite limited. So those were some of the issues in terms of monitoring and evaluation. And then also we saw this lack of evidence-based policies. So there was lack of research, particularly longitudinal research, that would have contributed to identifying the gaps in the system and building more effective policy and more contextual policy for the Jamaican context in particular. So for instance, it's practice in Jamaica that children who are eligible for adoption are not generally placed in foster care. So children in foster care, by the agency's definition, are not necessarily eligible for adoption. There's no data collected on adoption or foster care in Jamaica, or there has been limited data collection for these practices to be considered evidence-based. And there's no real follow-up process in place for children who transition out of care to determine, again, longitudinally, the overall effectiveness of this institution. We also saw that there was a lack of collaboration between stakeholders. As I mentioned, there's limited sharing of information due to the disjointed kind of governance structure that we see in place. There's a failure to incorporate the voice of the youth. So the Children's Advisory Panel is somewhat tokenistic in its approach in terms of symbolic gestures, rather than children actually having a voice in terms of implementation of policy. There's no evidence that children have been directly involved in policy making. There's also a failure to partner with CSOs to reconcile the limited resources. So many children's homes are often dependent on volunteers for medical care and for resources, which makes the delivery of resources inconsistent and not based on any best practice or best standard of care. And so as a result, what we really see is more mistreatment of children and neglect of children in care. There's poor documentation, case files are not maintained. Over 148 children had to be removed from adult remand centers. We know about the fire at Walker's Place of Safety, where 2 children died. And just in general, monitoring checks from over 20 facilities, none of them mention educational programs. So there's clearly a gap in terms of there's clearly an impact in terms of how these 4 areas of concern have an impact on children directly. And so we also see a limited success of children transitioning into family-based care, particularly for vulnerable children, such as children who are disabled, teenage mothers or teenage pregnant girls. There's often a difficulty for them to transition into foster care or to being adopted. And so ultimately, there are approximately 290 children that transition out of care because they turn 18 and have never been adopted or fostered or inconsistently fostered. And so in terms of recommendations, Capri came up with some short-term, some medium-term, and some long-term recommendations, which are on the screen. So in terms of legislative reform, we really wanted to see the reform of the Child Care and Protection Act, the Adoption Act as well, and then adoption or incorporation of the CRC and the UN guidelines on alternative care. We also wanted to see some database management implementation. So making sure that the SOHIMA software package is available and being utilized across all relevant agencies, consistent data collection as well as digitization of files, and then use of this data in longitudinal research to determine the effectiveness of separate systems, but also the system as a whole. We also wanted to see increased representation and accountability. So the Advisory Council, which has recently been convened as a means of independent oversight, is a great step. But then also the Children's Advisory Panel should be dependent, which is currently dependent on an educational performance, should really shift to represent the needs and the views of children who are most at risk in state care, such as the disabled and teenage mothers. And so those are some of the recommendations that we came across. And, I think it's apparent from the research that there's a lack of support for children in care, which has poor consequences for children that are transitioning out of care, and so ultimately the society. And I think, some of these recommendations being recommended is a great step by the CPFSA and by the ministry to hopefully provide a better standard of care for children in care. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leanne Levers. You actually have 3 minutes and 46 seconds left. So that is good, because that doesn't mean that the next presenter will have 18 minutes, right? The next presenter will still have 15 minutes, but this will allow us to have greater discussion at the end. So our next presenter, our next panelist will be Mrs. Cecile Minot. So as usual, you have 15 minutes, and as soon as I see your PowerPoint, I will start my timer. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to share this afternoon. I am going to try and share my screen. I hope everyone can see. Can everyone see?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Oh, and yes, perfect.
Wonderful, great. All right. Good afternoon again, everyone. I just want to share this evening on a project. So in 2012, 2013, the Caribbean Child Development Center began some discussions with the Child Protection and Family Services Agency, CPFSA, as to how we could try to formalize their existing transitional program that they had throughout the agency. And this was for children 14 to 18 years who are leaving state care. So we continued the discussion, and we ended up with our project, Transitional Living Program for Children in State Care in Jamaica. And I would like to share with the information that came out of this. It was a 6-year project, ended in 2020, was funded by the USAID for approximately $5 million. So as we look at the project and what it was all about, I want to share the objectives with you. So as I said, it was a 6-year project. And our objective was first to improve the transition to independent living for Jamaican youths who were leaving state care at 18 years, and also to reduce the risk factor associated with low skill development, inadequate life skills, and also poor self-image. So in order for us to look at improving this, we began with the children from age 13, 14, because we felt that we needed to prepare them as we moved along. Now, the project objectives were achieved through various means. What we did was we provided life skills coaching, and I'll explain further on how we did that, vocational skills training, transitional housing, mentoring, and also building the capacity of the Child Protection and Family Service agencies in order for this to be sustained once the project was completed. I'm going to share with you some of the activities that we had from 2014 to, as I said, indicated to you that we completed in November 2020. First and foremost, for any project, and in order for us to maintain the project, we went ahead and we signed a memorandum of understanding with the CPFSA. So that it was signed between the University of the West Indies Open Campus and the CPFSA. And that was done in 2016. So if you notice, although the project started in 2014, it took us a while with paperwork and everything to get everything up on order, but we finally did get that signed, as well as we had started a couple of the activities previous to that. The first activity that we did carry out was that we did a needs assessment, because even though we have this project, you have to remember that one of the things we needed to do was to conduct and find out exactly what was happening what existed currently and what existed internationally when it comes to transitioning from state care. So we did the needs assessment through a desk review, group consultations with the various stakeholders, which included youth in care, care alumni, visits to local, as well as international transitional living program. And Professor Meeks had shared some of the results in an earlier presentation on that. As we moved, one of the things that we needed to ensure that was done was that a standard operating procedure was prepared. And this was prepared so that at the end of the day, we would have this for CPFSA to follow and for it to be approved. So we'll have a structured transitional care for students. So it was drafted. We then went on, and as I mentioned to you, we had life skills coaching. Well, the way we did the life skills coaching was that we trained 40 of CPFSA officers to be trainers themselves. And then they in turn went ahead and trained their officers, managers of the residential cares, and other managers within the system, both private and public, in life skills coaching. A training manual was also developed and handed over so that this could be continued. So at the end of the day, we had over 514 caregivers who were equipped by the life skills trainers in life skills coaching. And then we had the coaching guide for caregivers was developed. As we went through, we also needed to look at our youth. And as we worked with our youth, we had over 957 youths in the state care system who were exposed to life skills coaching. So the training started in June 27, and at the end of the day, we were able to touch on 957 youths. And they were exposed with training from not just the officers that I had said before, but also with the caregivers themselves. We then had another component because if we're going to help children to transition, we looked at it and felt that they needed to be given a starter kits. And I believe one of my previous presenters spoke about this. So the starter kits actually just had a number of personal items that we feel any youth upon reaching the age of 18 or leaving home, as you would say, needed some goodies to carry with them. And what it had in it also a guide for independent living, some documents with folders, toiletries, first aid items. These documents were like their passport, their birth certificate, things that they would need as they move forward to continue education or to get a job. That was a part of it. We also needed, as we went forward, to ensure that vocational skills training was done, as mentioned before. And throughout the years, we had 770 state youths within the care system who were trained in various vocational skills. And actually 517 of them completed their training and received a certificate. We were also able to place about 13 of those youth in the transition to work placement program. So we're giving them an overall as to this is what it is, this is what you need, and this is how you move into the world of work. Now, all along, these youth were being mentored. We also assisted them with employment opportunities, because once you're getting the skills, we needed to ensure that we put together a network of public and private sector companies, and they were able to be mentored. We had, at the end of the project, there was over 122 youth who had gained employment, and 29 of those youth were provided with entrepreneurship training support for their startup, their business startup. And this was geared for self-employment. And those youth really did amaze us with what they were able to do. Now, a large part of this is that one of the things that we recognize, that some of our young persons had nowhere to go upon leaving state care. As you know, the law says at 18, you have to leave state care, but there was nowhere for them to go. They couldn't go back home. There was no family for them to integrate in, or there was issues within their community. So the project provided what we call transitional housing apartment complexes. And so we had 46 females and 6 males between the ages of 18 and 21 who were placed in the transitional apartment complexes. And this was up to a maximum of 4 years, or it would depend on if they were in the university, what would happen. So as we look, we have 2 fully furnished transitional housing apartment complexes were constructed. And as I indicated before, these were for youth who had absolutely nowhere to go. As I mentioned to you, we also had the mentorship program. So throughout every step of the way, our youth were mentored. So we had 124 mentors were recruited and trained, 87 youths participated, and we had 76 mentor-mentee matches. We also completed exit readiness profile for 400 youths. And Professor Meek spoke about this earlier, so I will not mention it now. One of the things we are currently doing is that we are completing, well, we're in the middle of doing a longitudinal study on the youth who have already left and were placed in the transitional housing. We're in year 2 of that, and we have another year or 2 to go. So hopefully we will be able to share those results at that time. The University of the West Indies Open Campus also provided 39 scholarships in continuing education for the youth who were transitioning out of state care. We were also able, as I mentioned before, to strengthen a number of aspects of the CPFSA. We assisted with the SOHIMA phase 2 of the case management system. We provided 80 laptops for the field officers so that would help with the SOHIMA. We provided 4 buses, including a second mobile mental health Smiles bus. We also provided trauma-informed care training for some of the staff members, bearing in mind that this is, and they would then pass it on. And then we were able to assist with 2 exiting exposition, and we helped with one of the field service conferences which CPFSA assisted with. So as indicated, we are able to be helped. We have handed over the project to the CPFSA, who have continued in their way to continue to use what was given to them. And hopefully we'll see it continue as we speak. Thank you very much. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. You have 4 minutes remaining.
That's okay. We can save it for question and answers.
Yes. And further detailed discussions. Okay, so our final panelist is Mr. Warren Thompson. So similar to the other presenters, you have 15 minutes. And I'll start timing you once I see your PowerPoint.
All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting us to this very important conversation on, looking at the context of child protection in the Caribbean. And this afternoon, I'm going to be focusing on the context within which the Child Protection and Family Services Agency works. I am going to just start by telling you a little bit about us and what it is that we do. So the CPFSA was founded in 2017 out of a merger between the Child Development Agency and the Office of the Children's Registry. And of course, the Child Development Agency was founded in 2003 out of a merger between the Children's Services Division and the Adoptions Unit and the Child Support Unit. Our vision is a country where children achieve their full potential in nurturing environments with full access to developmental and social services supported by our agency, a collaborative, child rights centered, results driven, and technology enabled employer of choice. Just to move, we do a wide variety or provide a wide variety of services from intake and investigations in keeping with the mandatory reporting framework that we have here in Jamaica. We provide licensing and regulatory services for residential childcare facilities. We provide case management services for children on supervision orders, those on fit person orders in programs such as foster care, family integration, reintegration. And of course, we service the adoption board by through our adoptions unit. We also serve as the central authority for on the Hague Convention on the Civil Aspects of International Child Abduction, mainly parental abductions. We provide services to the court. We monitor police lockups for children. We provide counseling and psychotherapeutic services, including play therapy. We also house the government's Missing Children's Intervention, and that is the Ananda Alert Secretariat. And we provide primary intervention services through our Child and Family Support Unit. And of course, we do public education. You just heard about our transitional living program, which we are still implementing. And we provide cross-jurisdictional social work services. Just to look at the context, I tried to compare some key metrics with 2004 when we started the CDA then, and 2020. And if you look at children in care, the numbers are not that different. When you look at children in institutions, we're off by a couple hundred. Children in family environments, less than 100. And which is good, I should say. We have less childcare facilities. We have fewer places of safety. We have one less children's home. And that number has actually decreased since 2020 because we have had a number of closures. We have had a significant increase in the number of social workers who are providing either frontline work or case management services. And I didn't have the data for 2004, but in 1993, when there were 50 social workers working in the Children's Services Division, we had an average caseload of 150 cases per officer. And we have now anywhere between 120, 150. We do have some parishes where the caseload is low, so we have an officer who may have 40 cases, getting closer to where we want to go. But our officers have been providing more services to children who are not necessarily in care. So we have officers with caseload of children in our Child and Family Support Unit or being served by a Child and Family Support Unit, and those cases can be closer to 200. So, and in terms of the number of social workers doing direct case management, that number is not 202, because out of this, we have social workers who are doing investigations, social workers who are doing intake and assessment, social workers who provide screening through our mobile mental health unit, social workers assigned to missing children cases, social workers assigned to institutional monitoring, and so on. So in terms of the number of officers doing direct case management to children in care, that is not 202. We receive through the National Children's Registry approximately 1,200 reports per month. And all those reports have to be investigated by our social workers. We have just about 2% who are taken before the court or who may have to be removed from their families and come into the tertiary care system. But we try to maintain children in family environments, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. And we try to provide intervention services through primary intervention services through our child and family support unit. So looking at the current context, some factors to consider, factors that impact our service delivery. We're looking at financial, infrastructural, human resources, and policy-related factors. Financially, we are solely funded by the government of Jamaica, and of course, the government is funded, through taxes. And when they divide up the funds that are available, we are provided with a ceiling. And of course, the amount of funds that we get is influenced or impacted by the policy priorities of the government, trading off in terms of return on investments and so on. There are, some policy priorities that may come to the fore, or program initiatives that may come to the fore that we have to implement that may not, but we may not get the funding for it. So for example, last year, we would have launched our 24-hour child abuse reporting line, that's 211. And to do that, we had to take on additional staff. We had to implement the technology required. We had to do public education campaign, and all of that had to come from existing funds. In fact, we, based on the number of officers that we have, I give you that we have 202 social workers employed to the agency. We don't have that many posts. So we actually employ maybe about 50 more officers than we have on our structure. And we're currently going through a merger exercise with the National Parenting Support Commission that may look at providing the additional posts that we need. We justify the hires to the government by saying the work is there to be done, and we need the persons to do it. So it doesn't always fly, but we do try. We are also impacted by the what is going on in the economy. So inflation. I mean, we have about more than 2,000 children in residential childcare facilities, most of them in private facilities. And we have to ensure that they are fed, that they get medication, educational supplies, and so on. We provide to those facilities a subvention of $6,000 per child per week. And we have seen facilities, especially smaller facilities, where the funds provided is grossly insufficient, and as a result, they fold. So, we have made a presentation regarding this, but the cabinet has not yet made a decision regarding increasing the amount of funds paid to private facilities for the children that we have there. We have had, almost every year, we overrun what is budgeted, and we have to try to find ways to justify the funds to the Ministry of Finance. Another financial issue for us is low compensation. Across the public service, social workers, the salary or the remuneration for social workers tends to not be comparable to other professions. It tends to be on the lower end, and that impacts staff well-being and staff morale and so on. Infrastructural, we do have a number of residential childcare facilities that require renovations, and we have been doing some, certainly for the government facilities. And we have developed a grading scheme for facilities in general, including state-owned facilities. And what we do is, based on the grade that the facility may get on an assessment, we identify the areas with which we have to work with them to have improvements done. In fact, there is one facility now that is doing some renovations. It's a private facility, but the majority of the funds for those renovations are coming from the CPFSA's coffers. We are currently in a project as a part of the Public Sector Transformation Initiative to strengthen the ICT capacity of the agency. And you'd have heard Dr. Levers talking about expanding SOHIMA usage. As a part of that, the National Children's Registry we have done some work to ensure that the officers doing intake and assessment at the registry are on the same system that the CDA legacy staff would be using. So right now, when you receive a report at 211, for example, that officer will enter that report into the system and refer that report to the investigations unit within the system. If that child comes into direct care, then the case managers, case workers would update the case recordings and so on in the system. We have been doing some focus on data management. We have recognized that it's a gap. And the National Children's Registry, although we were using Microsoft Word and so on, there was always a back-end data entry process. So we have an extensive database looking at child abuse reports from 2007 all the way up to 2020. And I say 2020 because subsequent to 2020, those reports would have been entered into SOHIMA and are being entered as a back-end data entry project supported by UNICEF. We have transportation issues based on the locations of residential childcare facilities. Sometimes a child may be placed in St. James or in Trelawney, but the child has court in Kingston. And whenever the child has to come to court, we have to work out the transportation arrangements. And of course, we'll appreciate that with the concerns expressed by the Ministry of Finance regarding spend related to travel and so on, we have to be jumping and hopping and skipping to try to find innovative ways to address some of these issues without incurring, exorbitant costs. Human resource concerns or issues. We do have an issue regarding retention of staff. We have a lot of staff members who are burnt out because of the high case loads and because of the low remuneration and benefits and so on. We do have a gap internally, which we are seeking to fill at this point in terms of systematic onboarding and training. We have recognized that while we do have policies and we have procedures and protocols in place, there is sometimes a gap in getting that, those policies being enforced by the officers working on the ground. And we recognize that because we have this crisis of the immediate, where once something happens, we have to jump. When a new staff comes in, the cases are there to be worked. We sometimes, don't follow through with ensuring that these new hires get the training that is required and that they have a full understanding of the procedures and what is required in their case planning and following up on the recommendations of the psychologists and those kinds of things. We do have a number of staff experiencing vicarious trauma, especially our investigators and our first responders. And as a result, we have had to be spending money to provide the debriefing experiences and even more in-depth counseling and psychotherapy, therapeutic support, because we have seen the impact of the work on staff mental health. And listen, when I say we have seen it, we have really seen it, without saying much more. We do not, in terms of providing services to children, we do not have sufficient mental health services in-house or even externally. We have 4 associate clinical psychologists employed to the agency who provide services to the 5,000 children in care. Although they do see the more acute cases, we have been trying to boost the complement of staff that we have, or the cohort of staff that we have with play therapy training and so on, or training in the expressive therapies, to see if we can, leverage those skills and competencies to buffer the mental health issue that we are experiencing. And certainly, this has been exacerbated since COVID-19. The children, have to be in the facilities or have to be in homes, not going to school, and so on. And we have actually been seeing the issue not only with children in care, but even in the cases that are coming to us. So there is a real issue where mental health is concerned. We have a number of children, many children, with diagnosed psychiatric disorders, and we have to be putting them in the same facilities with children who do not have those issues, because the government of Jamaica does not, at this point, have an institution providing residential mental health support for children and so on. We have a number of policies that impact the work that we do. So, for example, you would have, I told you earlier that we are promoting family-based care. So we have a 0 to 3 policy where once a child under 3 comes into care, the practice is not to place a child in a residential childcare facility, but to place a child, to provide services to the family to have the child remain home, and where that is not possible and the removal is necessary, to have that child placed in a foster care family environment, or have the child freed as soon as possible for adoption. So we have a program of deinstitutionalization guided by the UN Alternative Care Guidelines, and we currently are working on a 5-year plan towards deinstitutionalization. We do not have a policy articulated regarding transitioning of children from care. Let me see, I'm not sure how I'm doing with time.
Yes, Mr. Thompson, your time is up.
My time is up? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Would you permit me to finish this, the focus on policies?
Yes.
Okay, sure.
2 more minutes.
Okay, sure. So in terms of transitioning from care, we have taken over the transitional living program, but the government of Jamaica has not yet made budgetary allocation for that program. If I can tell you, for the quarter, April to June, under that program, we have spent over 112 million, I believe, in terms of education, mental health support for the youngsters in that program, housing, and so on. At the end of April, we had 455 youngsters who were participating in that program. We realized that the CPFSA can't do it by ourselves, and we rely on the partnerships. But of course, there are challenges all around in terms of the state services, whether it's public health, public mental health, the PATH program, and so on. We do have our internal policies regarding standards of care or field services guidelines. We are guided now by our National Plan of Action for an Integrated Response to Children and Violence, which is an multi-sectoral plan. And of course, we are seeking to transform our records and information management procedures in the agency, being guided, of course, by the government of Jamaica's RIM policy. So we are impacted by these things, and we have to find innovative ways to provide services to children based on the policy directives that come, or in the absence of policy directives and legislative provisions. And I just want to show you that we are looking to address some of the gaps. And one of the things that we are looking at now is using the data that we have to do to develop an early warning system where we can do some predictive risk modeling to identify children who may need additional, or families that may need additional support before those families have to come into direct care services. And I think I can end it. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much.
No problem.
So I am going to open the floor to the questions. And I see where I have a question from Rihanna Jose Razak. How many psychologists are part of the CPFSA? And can you, as presenters, please turn on your cameras so that the persons on Facebook can see you. Thank you. So, right. So the question was from Rihanna. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. How many psychologists are part of CPFSA?
The CPFSA currently has 4 psychologists.
4. Wow. Okay. Thank you. And I have some questions here as well, and I'll start with Jacqueline first. Will you say what were some of the factors that caused the delay in the implementation of, you had mentioned it, the implementation of the legislation across the OECS countries? So what was the delay there?
I think the delay was to some extent, as indicated, the lack of a robust infrastructure to support the implementation of the legislation. So countries were wary about, can we meaningfully implement this? And so we're past it because they felt that it was a good piece of legislation, but then had some serious concerns about how they were going to effectively implement. Others were just not properly trained in the legislation. So it was about levels of awareness, levels of competence and familiarity with the unknown, feeling comfortable with the existing laws, as deficient as they were, and so just not feeling that they had had enough exposure to the new law. And as I said, in some instances, just a as I said, a reluctance to reject the status quo.
Okay, so I have a follow-up question. How did you get around that then? How did you ensure that there was an awareness? What was done?
Yeah. Both the OECS Commission and UNICEF partnered then on a massive and intense sort of capacity building initiative. So we had to develop training modules, and because the legislation is similar, because it was patterned on model legislation, it was fairly easy to move from country to country, and this was before COVID, and do on the ground, intense, well-informed training workshops, using the legislation in a very practical way, ensuring that they could apply it to fact situations, and sort of really demystifying the law. People are intimidated by law. I mean, you know, lawyers have created that mystique about it. And so it was really about sort of just making them feel comfortable and being able to apply it in very practical terms.
Okay, thank you. I have a question. And so before I ask the question, please, persons on Facebook joining us, please post your questions in the comments section. All right, so Leanne, how was the Capri report received? Because you said it was March of, was it this year or last year? Last year. How has it been received?
I think it's been received very well. You know, from a public perspective, following the report, a lot of children or a lot of adults who are formerly in state care reached out to Capri and, you know, expressed their pleasure at seeing the report being published and identifying the gaps that we did, and definitely felt that the research resonated with their experiences. We found that they were also very, very, very interested and willing to support the system. So many of them felt that, you know, when they were in state care, they didn't have mentors and they wanted to participate in mentoring programs, and certainly participating. And I think it's the Cradle to Care or Cradle to Loving Arms program that CPFSA is doing. So they really were eager to see the system improve for the sake of the younger cohort that were still in state care. And then from a political perspective, actually, Minister Morgan was very, very receptive to many of the ideas that we had. The advisory council was formed subsequently after that report came into play. In terms of, he was one of the first people to read the report and really went out of his way to have meetings and to discuss. And, also I know I've had advisors that were specialists in this area to help move the legislation process along, because that process is always a long, can take a very long time, the legislation. So I think there definitely were efforts to try and improve and get it right, but always, the issue of resources and so on can always play a factor. And then the CSOs, children's homes, they all felt, the response was very positive generally.
Excellent. It's rewarding and satisfying when you do such a report and there's that positive response and you see actions towards, implementing recommendations. All right.
Definitely.
And yes, what were some of the challenges in implementing transition program? I know you kind of touched on some of them, but can you just, give us a bit more details? It's only 15 minutes. So what were some of the challenges?
Okay, so like everything else, I think one of our biggest challenges was the construction of the 2 transitional apartment complexes. We learned a lot when it came to construction. And between ourselves and CPFSA, we were able to try everything to ensure that those apartment complex were built. I mean, the usual approvals took a little time. And so we learned so much, but that was one of our biggest hurdles. So when we set the timeline for that to be completed with the approval process, it took much longer. Also working with the contractors, trying to ensure that they did what we needed them to do. Because as you know, when it comes to a transitional apartment complex, the safety had to be a big one. So we had to ensure that all of the safety was in place. But it was completed, and I think we all agreed we needed to have a party afterwards. Another big challenge we had, and it was mentioned throughout, is the staff. I mean, CPFSA needs a lot more staff, I'm here to tell you, because even in implementing our program, we had to rely on the staff that was there. And the staff, they really got engaged in the program, tried their best to ensure that they could follow through and continue it. But when you have limited staff doing everything, it took a little longer than everybody would know. So, but they did try, and they were able to move forward with some of it. And we did ask the staff what kind of needs they had, and they were able to give us. So that helped some of the challenges as we were going along, working very closely with the staff of CPFSA. One of the problems that we had with the vocational skills, which we're still trying to, as we do continue with the longitudinal study, the dropout rate for the youths from that program was also very high and very concerning to all of us, staff at CPFSA and ourselves. Right. So we've been looking at that to ensure. So that was a challenge, trying to get the youth to be a part of that particular program. And some came forward and completed it, as you see, but that was one of the challenges that we had as we move forward. And there were many others, but that's just some that come to mind.
The top 3, right, yeah. Right.
All right.
Yes, I want to, before I ask Mr. Thompson his question, I want to thank Mrs. Celia Burke for coming and just sharing that really detailed, rich report from OECS. So thank you very much. I know you have to leave early, but we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
All right, so participants on Facebook, please remember to share your questions in the comment section so that we can ask the panelists. And also that this program will be placed on the YouTube page. That's for the UE Museum, right? So this,
yes, it will be on the UE Museum YouTube page along with panel 1.
Okay, excellent. Because I know that there are some persons who would want to listen to the report. Mr. Thompson, I am very much interested in the vicarious trauma that you mentioned for the workers, and can you explain what that is and what, I know you mentioned it, but what are some of the concrete ways in which you help your staff to ensure that they are mentally healthy to do their jobs well? Okay, you are muted. You have to unmute, please.
Yes, thank you. Right, so we are looking at our staff wellness activities. But outside of that, where we do promote self-care and that kind of thing. But outside of that, for some teams, they are required to do sessions with a doctoral level psychologist. So they are mandated to check in. I think they check in every quarter, at least once every quarter with the psychologist. And if they require more intense support, we have an arrangement with Family Life Ministries, where all they need to do is say to HR, I need to see a counselor. and an appointment is set for them to go, and they follow up on those appointments. So that is
Excellent.
so those are the main approaches that we take at this time.
All right, so those are quite concrete. So any more questions from Facebook? Dr. Roper?
So we haven't any questions, but I do have a question. I have a whole lot of questions because we've had the three programs. Right. So we had a program with Armadale survivors that's only available by request, at the request of the panelists as well as panel one. And I must say it's a very depressing kind of thing to listen to, because CPFSA is clearly overburdened. Right. With its very wide mandate. And so my question for Leanne is really about the compilation of the reports. What was some of the issues that you have? Because you identify in the report that there's a data problem, but on the ground, what does that really look like? Because so much of this is about face-to-face interaction.
I think, as you mentioned, let me speak to the collection of information. We did a lot of qualitative research. So we spoke to stakeholders, all different stakeholders, from politicians to policy teams within the ministry, ministers themselves, managers of children's homes, other relevant agencies, CSOs, etc. We tried to cover the full scope of stakeholders in speaking to kind of put the pieces together, in addition to the limited data that's available. So I would say the biggest obstacle that we would have faced was actually accessing data. A lot of the data was older. There wasn't a consistent collection of data, particularly as it relates to the monitoring reports. So, a lot of the monitoring reports were not filled out appropriately. They were missing information. And so what that really means is children getting lost in the system. We're not tracking educational process. We're not tracking, children can easily get lost between the foster care. They can and that ultimately results in a lack of adoption and a lack of foster care. There are over 138 approved adopters in 2020 waiting for a child to be placed with them, and that longest one having been approved in 2011. So there's obviously it's slowing down the system, it's making it less effective. And so ultimately it's having impact on children on the ground in that real way, is that there are limited options for family-based care through foster care and adoption as a result of the systemic issue, not because we have a lack of people who are willing to participate and to foster and to support the system and to support children in care. So I would say that's kind of the impact that the lack of data and the slow-moving legislation has in real terms.
All right, so I have two questions, but I don't know if Mr. Thompson wanted to respond to Leanne.
I mean, I'll just say, so we are aware of some of the issues. I mean, even in terms of just the value of administrative data. One of the things that we realize is that even our officers, as they complete forms and write case notes, they don't see that as data. They don't see it as data that can be used for much more than the current purpose. So we have had to be doing that kind of sensitization. And just we even yesterday we were talking about some of the gaps, because one of the gaps that I recognized too, when a child has to be removed, for example, there's a disruption in the child's education. And when you think about a child's right to education, that is a breach by the state. So we now have to be trying to wrap our heads around how do we do the removals if they are necessary, but ensuring that all the needs and the services are met and the services are being provided in a rights-based, child-centered kind of way. So, and certainly the information management is a part of that process. So we are aware, and we're brainstorming about how we can address some of these issues.
Right. So this is where I want to jump in, because I'm from an education background, and that's one of the areas that hit me when I was reviewing the Capri report is that gap when it comes to the education system. And you just mentioned it, Warren, that education gap. And I guess part of me is wondering what can be done to facilitate that, to ensure that if children are moved, there is still that consistent support education wise. Is it tutoring? So I'm throwing it out to all of you. I mean, Cecile, Warren, Leanne.
Yes. Yeah, it's not such an easy question to respond to. There are some facilities where we do have many places of safety where we do have teachers and instructors employed, but there are still some cases where the children fall through the cracks. So I'm open to ideas. Yeah.
Well, I think the report actually speaks to some of those, how we can fill some of those gaps. The idea of the sharing of information and collaboration across agencies. So we're making sure that each aspect of the child's life is really being attended to, whether that's housing, whether that's education, whether that's maintaining a connection with their family so that they can ultimately return to their families. That's the ideal, right? The goal. I think definitely incorporating the voice of the children, which I think every panelist has spoken to, making sure that children are being heard. Do they want to maintain a place close to school? The school that they're already attending, just taking into those case-by-case issues as well, I think would be some of the steps. And then from a structural or governance perspective, really taking into account monitoring and oversight. If we know that we're making sure that monitoring officers are mentioning the presence of education. Yes, the child has been going to school, making sure that foster care, there are more social workers so that the children in foster care can be frequently or met with more frequently to get a consistent overview of what's happening. Building better relationships with the foster parents themselves, with the social workers, that being a part of that, family-based comprehensive overview in terms of care are just some of the things that I think the Capri report speaks to, and other people, other presentations have spoken to as well.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Cecile.
Yeah. Hi, Warren. I think also what would help most is if you in the education system. So we're speaking about the education system. So if a child is moving from one school, it has to be, and you spoke to this, Leon, that everybody needs to have the information so that things can be set in place. And I think that is one of the biggest issue we have. And we all spoke about it. There is a gap. CPFSA has their information, but then it doesn't go anywhere else. And I think this is something we need to look at, especially when it comes to a child. All the ministries need to be involved. And we keep saying that a child is being left, or a gap. There's a gap with a child is being left behind. But if we could set up some form of system, whether it's a data system or that has a number, it doesn't have to be the child's name, but something that can say, this child is moving from this school. Is there an opening at this school? So that we can have a smooth transition and the child won't miss out on education. Because I agree with you, Ms. Moderator, that is a big problem. And the children get lost in the system of education. And as you know, Warren knows that as well. But I know they're trying, but I think all of us have to work together in order to help it, because CPFSA cannot do it alone. They don't have the resources to do it. I can tell you that. After 6 years, I can tell you a lot about CPFSA.
So I have a question, Yolanda, if you don't mind, I jump in here. I'm trying to get a sense of the full volume of children that CPFSA interacts with, because you see that there are 1,200 calls on average coming in from the registry. Plus,
not calls.
Right.
Not calls, actual reports.
Actual reports. That's not the calls. Yeah. Okay, so that's a different set of volume data. Okay, so
because we get a whole lot of calls.
1,200 reports. Then the is it 5,000, almost 5,000 in state-run homes. And I suppose that there's some peripheral numbers also engaged in that debate. And I'm assuming, this is my assumption, that CPFSA is only engaging the worst cases. Am I correct?
I'm not sure if I can answer the last one.
Okay.
But yes, so 1,200 reports per month, and that is actual children who require services. That number now, I don't know if we can count it at this point, because it includes the children who come in with behavioral problems. They have to be taken through some behavioral modification programs, or families come in and the parents require parenting training and that kind of thing. And that's separate from the 5,000 that are actually in care. Those in care are the ones who were removed from their homes and are in alternative placements, whether in a residential setting or in a family-based placement. So the truth is, the actual number, I'm sure we can get it, but it's a fluid number. We do intake every day. Unfortunately, I can't give it to you today, but it's certainly way more than the 5,000, right? Just to say, the Children's Registry receives anywhere between 12,000 and 13,000 reports per year. And usually a quarter of those are children that are already in the system. And the remaining three quarter are children being reported for the first time.
I have here a comment from Melody Samuel. She has two comments, but I'll share the short of the two. She says, commendations on your frank reporting, Mr. Thompson. Thanks for keeping it real.
Melody is one of our psychologists.
Okay.
It's Melody.
So my question is then for Cecile. Like in our first panel, oh no, my brain just went blank. The head of social work actually presented about social work research and training center. So the kind of interventions that social workers provide, and also the problem of retention. But and I know that the new area is to look at the issue of the adoption legislation and practices in Jamaica. But what are some of the other interventions that could be done from a university perspective that could probably provide, I don't know, some additional support to CPFSA, or to train or have people who are properly trained, I think, to provide to be key practitioners?
Well, I do know Ms. Buchanan. It's a social work training and research center. They do provide training for CPFSA. They have done the social work. Their social workers have been through our professional development programs. We are currently in the process of about to offer mental health first responders professional development program, which came out of a need from CPFSA when we recognized that some of their workers needed more assistance. So what can the university do? We continue to look at the needs that we have here, not just in Jamaica, but the region, but particularly here in Jamaica. So when the needs come to us, we develop a program, a course, and then we offer it so that we can try and help them as they move through. Another one that we're currently working on is a play therapy course, a short play therapy course, which would be offered to that would be offered also to our CPFSA and other caregivers and teachers working in the system who have to work with children who may have an issue. And it's just to give them an awareness of what you can do before you refer for that professional assistance. So those are some of the things that we're doing now. Our programs and our courses come out of the needs of the community. And for CPFSA, we've been working with them now for quite a while. And I know the SWTRC has been working with them, so has the Caribbean Child Development Center. And that's because of what we do. The Mona campus has also offered other courses. So we continue to listen, and we provide the training for the needs that what they need. So if there's ICT need, then once we discuss it with them, then we'll develop the program accordingly. And these are university courses, of course, through the open campus for them. So that's what we've been doing, Ms. Roper, trying to assist as the call comes.
And I want to ask a question just for those who are listening. What is play therapy? Because we've been using that word and people are not accustomed to it.
Okay,
so what is play therapy? It's
a form of therapy. However, it's done through play. So, for example, rather than sitting down and talking, when you're working with young children, talking doesn't work. But you provide them with, say you give them a toy and they're able to show you and express themselves through that particular toy. So that's what it's about. It's actually, as Melody would say, keeping it real and ensuring that they share us and we don't put words into their mouth. So
excellent. Okay, thank you. And I want to ask for some final comments from the panelists. There's so much more that we could talk about. For me, one of my final comments, I guess, is that for the Capri report and what Cecile, you shared, just seemed like this, there was this connection, because you spoke about the lack of longitudinal studies, but yet here's this 6-year study. And I hope that you will write it up and publish from it, so that that's another form of documentation for somebody else. So thank you for that. So yes, I'm going to open the floor to Leanne, Warren, and Cecile for their final comments as we wrap up.
So perhaps I can piggyback on what you just said. So yes, the research that we're doing will be handed over, because even during the project, every information that we received as we went through, we handed over to CPFSA and the ministry for them to look at it and see how things can be done. So that's something that will continue, and especially with the longitudinal study. And we will be writing it up to ensure that it becomes something for persons to look at and see how we can help the children transitioning out of state care. And my final thought on this is that CPFSA, after spending, and I used to work with them before, but after working with them intimately for the last 6 years, they have been doing a lot to help our children transition out of state care as well as within state care. But as we all notice, the resources is just not there. And I think if we were to be able to give them what the needs were, and we assist as best as we can, then we'd have a different system. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Leanne, Warren.
Yeah, let Leanne go first.
Thank you. Just to add that, I think, as Cecile said, there is a genuine effort on the part of the CPFSA to improve upon things, and more importantly, the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information. I think they're really trying to provide as much resources and support as they possibly can, and they definitely have demonstrated, at least following the report, during the latter half of last year, that it was a priority. It was at least becoming a priority for them. And I think what's really important, actually, just piggybacking off of what Cecile said, is not just the sharing of information with the CPFSA, but all of the ministries. We need to share the information. There's I think a personal or a professional obligation for all of us to be sharing across ministries, to make sure that this is disseminated to the public, so that the public are informed of the various programs that they might be able to participate in. So CSOs can be aware, because CSOs really need to be equipped with that information as well, to determine what kind of resources they should be focusing on helping to provide. And so I think the more we can share this information and the data, and the more we can carry out bits of research like the one that Cecile is doing with the longitudinal research, is the more we're going to be able to fill those kind of policy gaps, and then figure out how to provide an increase or justify an increase in the spending that we see for children in care.
All right. Thank you. You actually said some of what I wanted to say, Leanne. The situation regarding children in Jamaica is not a CPFSA issue. I think all Jamaicans and every ministry and government agency should think about the role, that we play in making Jamaica a place that's fit for children. So, what we need is a multi-sectoral, joined up government kind of approach, and not just government, even civil society has a role to play in transforming our nation to make it really a place fit for children. And if Jamaica was a place fit for children, then CPFSA wouldn't have so much work to do. So I think we just have to continue to identify the synergies and the opportunities for collaborating to ensure that children in care, and not only children in care, but children in Jamaica in general, receive the kinds of services and support that they need. At the CPFSA, we're doing a lot. We are building our therapeutic center. We have plans for an assessment center for children in all regions. But that's just a subset. That will fill a gap, but there's a wider gap to be filled. You can provide services to a child, but then the wider family needs support. And we need the other partners to jump in to work with us to provide that kind of support. And Cecile, you will remember that we were working together on the multi-agency response to children, to child abuse, sorry. So we need to, go back to some of that, to get all the partners at the table to do this. So, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your expertise, sharing your expertise, your time on this very important issue. Context matters, Caribbean children in childcare. And I want to thank Leanne Levers, Warren Thompson, Cecile Minot, and Jacqueline, who had to leave early, but we appreciate her input in terms of looking at the Eastern Caribbean states. And we want to thank UA Museum, Dr. Shani Roper. Any last words before we close off? And thank you those on Facebook for listening. This will be put up, the YouTube link will be put up on the UA Museum web Facebook page for others to see, and please share it. I shared too late with some friends, and I hope that the link is there that they can listen to it, because this was rich and very important. So thank you, Dr. Roper.
All right, so just closing, this is the last in the series, and because I've sat through all of them, one of the things is that it's not just Jamaica that's not doing well in terms of raising children. It's the entire Caribbean, and it's very scary in terms of what's happening, especially in terms of some of the issues coming out of Barbados and so on. And it tells us that it's very important that we have platforms where we are sharing like this, where the information is clear and accessible, and we can see the connections right across the board. And of course, the UE Museum, as a department of the University of the West Indies, is committed to providing its platform as a space in terms of making things accessible, not just in exhibition format, but through programs that are reflective of the kind of work and needs that take place at the university and its impact on the region as a whole. I want to thank all the participants and our partners throughout the series. It's, I feel like the presenters have been just so open and so willing to share information, because they want civil society to be invested in changing our approach to engaging children, and then recognizing children as integral and important members of our community who have a right to be treated with respect, to be given a space to speak and to be honored, and their bodies and personhood being respected. So I just want to thank everyone. Our programs will be on YouTube, our YouTube page, and we want to thank our Facebook audience. The beauty of COVID has been virtual programming, and we've been committed to keep it short and tight and accessible. So thank you all, and we will have more programming in the next academic year because we're wrapping up for summer. All right, so thank you all for joining us today, and I look forward to potential future collaborations. The museum is here for alternate research purposes.